Daniel Reed stood motionless in the dark hallway of his own home when he heard the sound of metal scraping against the garage floor. Through the narrow gap of the door, he watched two HOA guards struggling to carry a nearly 100-pound safe out of his house. Behind them stood a woman who showed no fear at all. She wore an HOA windbreaker, held a clipboard against her chest, and calmly signed a paper as though the entire house belonged to her. Daniel did not call the police. He did not shout. He simply watched, because those two guards and the woman behind them did not know one simple fact. The safe they were stealing did not contain what they believed it did, and the man whose home they had just broken into was the detective who had been investigating them for weeks. The woman with the clipboard was Victoria Hale, 48 years old, president of the Homeowners Association, a woman who ran the neighborhood the way a general runs a war room. Victoria had built her reputation on control, on fines, on rules, enforced with a precision that felt less like community management and more like surveillance. Daniel Reed, 42, had moved into the gated community only a few months earlier, and to his neighbors he appeared to be nothing more than a quiet man who kept to himself, paid every fine without complaint, and never raised his voice at a single HOA meeting. That night, as the guards lifted the safe onto a dolly and wheeled it toward a waiting vehicle, Victoria leaned close to one of them and murmured a single instruction. "Move it carefully. We don't have much time." Daniel did not step forward. He did not flip on a light. He stood in the shadows of his own hallway and let them work. Let them sweat under the weight of the metal box. Let them believe they had gotten away with something. The larger of the two guards, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis, grunted as the safe shifted against the dolly straps, and Victoria hissed at him to be quieter. Daniel counted the seconds, timing their movements the way he had timed 100 stakeouts before, letting the scene play out exactly as he needed it to. When the safe finally cleared the garage door and the taillights of the vehicle disappeared down the winding street, Daniel walked to the small camera mounted above his front door, the one Victoria herself had once fined him for installing without prior HOA approval. He looked directly into the lens and allowed himself the smallest, quietest smile a man can wear when a trap has finally been sprung exactly the way he designed it. "Perfect," he said softly. "They just gave me everything I needed." 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have seemed possible to anyone watching from the outside. Victoria Hale had been sending Daniel notice after notice, almost from the day he arrived. His car was parked 6 inches over the painted line. His exterior camera violated Section 14 of the community bylaws. His garage door had been left open for 11 minutes past the permitted window. His trash bins were visible from the street 2 hours before collection. His porch light was, according to one memo, excessively bright and disruptive to neighboring properties. Daniel paid every fine without argument, and that, more than anything else, unsettled Victoria far more than resistance ever could have. Most residents fought back. Most residents complained, appealed, threatened to bring in lawyers of their own. Daniel simply wrote the check, smiled politely, and moved on with his day. To Victoria, a man who never pushed back was either a man with nothing to hide, or a man hiding something far larger than a parking violation. She began to watch him more closely, the way a predator studies prey that refuses to run. What she did not yet understand was that Daniel was watching her right back, and had been from the very beginning, cataloging every visit her officers made to his property, noting the times, the excuses, the small inconsistencies between what they claimed to be inspecting and what they actually spent their time doing once inside. Over those same weeks, a pattern had quietly emerged across the neighborhood, one that only a trained eye would have noticed. Several residents had reported missing belongings. One family lost nearly $3,000 in cash kept in a bedroom drawer. An elderly widower named Harold Pierce reported a set of jewelry gone from a locked box in his closet, heirlooms that had belonged to his late wife and could never truly be replaced. A young couple discovered important legal documents missing from a home office, papers tied to a pending property dispute that suddenly worked strangely in the association's favor once they vanished. Another resident lost a small personal safe entirely, vanished sometime during a weekend the family had spent out of town. Every single time, the HOA office dismissed the reports the same way, calling them a private security matter outside the association's jurisdiction, urging residents to file with the local police and let the community office focus on more pressing concerns like landscaping violations and mailbox regulations. Daniel, working quietly at night with case files spread across his kitchen table, began connecting threads that no ordinary resident would have thought to pull together. Every home that had experienced a theft had one thing in common. In each case, HOA representatives had requested access to the property in the weeks before the loss occurred, citing routine community inspections, mandatory smoke detector checks, or landscaping compliance reviews. In each case, Residents had either handed over a door code or allowed guards inside unsupervised, trusting the very organization that had systematically cataloged the layout of their homes, the location of their valuables, and the schedule of their absences. Victoria surrounded herself with a small, fiercely loyal circle of female HOA officers, women who wore matching windbreakers and carried the same clipboards, women who moved through the neighborhood with an authority that no one questioned, because questioning the HOA in this community had never gone well for anyone. Late one evening, Daniel opened a manila folder in the small office he had converted from a guest bedroom. Photographs of the affected homes were pinned along one wall, connected by red string to timeline notes and financial records he had spent weeks quietly assembling. He cross-referenced dates and addresses, building a spreadsheet no ordinary homeowner would ever have thought to compile, correlating inspection requests with reported losses down to the exact week. On the cover of the folder, in block letters he had typed himself, were the words that explained everything about why a man like Daniel Reed had chosen this particular house, in this particular neighborhood, at this particular time. Case 47B Residential Theft Ring. Daniel was not an ordinary homeowner drawn into a dispute with an overbearing association. He was a detective with the Major Crimes Division, and he had purchased the house specifically because it sat inside the boundary of a community that police had quietly flagged months earlier after a string of unexplained property crimes. Working alone, without informing his neighbors of his true profession, Daniel spent his nights reviewing neighborhood camera footage he had legally requested from a handful of cooperative homeowners, tracing a security vehicle that appeared near nearly every reported theft. He discovered a financial account tied to the HOA with payments that made no sense for a residential association, transfers routed through something calling itself a private security consulting firm, a name that returned no legitimate business filings when he searched the state registry. He also discovered that Victoria met regularly with a woman named Melissa Grant, the HOA's bookkeeper, a meticulous woman who kept the association's financial records and, as Daniel would later learn, kept several other things hidden as well. Some of the fine records Daniel pulled from the community portal had clearly been altered after the fact. Dates shifted, amounts changed, entire violations added retroactively to build a paper trail that made certain residents look far more troublesome than they actually were, a pattern that would later prove useful whenever the association needed grounds to justify an unscheduled inspection. One evening, Daniel picked up his phone and called a colleague outside the jurisdiction, a fellow detective who had helped him get the surveillance authorization approved months earlier. "Detective Reed, are you sure you want to go undercover this long?" The voice on the other end asked, genuine concern threading through the question. "Until they make the mistake I'm waiting for," Daniel answered, his eyes fixed on the folder in front of him. He was not a victim caught in an unfair housing dispute. He was the investigator inside the very case he appeared to be a bystander to, and Victoria Hale, along with everyone working beneath her, had no idea. Daniel stared at a photograph of Victoria clipped to the inside of the folder, her HOA badge photo smiling out at him with the same practiced pleasantness she wore at every community meeting. Beneath the photo, a printed label read simply, "Primary Person of Interest." Daniel understood something that neither Victoria nor her circle of loyal officers could have guessed. They were searching for something specific, something they believed he possessed, and their search had grown increasingly desperate over recent weeks, evident in the frequency of their visits and the thinly veiled excuses they used to justify each one. He noticed how their eyes moved past him toward the hallway closet, toward the garage, toward every space large enough to conceal a strongbox, and he understood that somewhere along the way, a rumor had reached Victoria that a resident on her list was quietly compiling a file dangerous enough to end everything she had built. He never confirmed or denied it. He simply let the rumor grow, feeding it small, deniable clues. A folder left visible on a car seat for a moment too long. A comment dropped carefully within earshot of a guard performing a routine inspection. So Daniel built them exactly what they were looking for. He purchased a heavy metal safe, nearly identical in size and weight to a genuine evidence container, and inside it he placed a careful mixture of falsified documents, counterfeit currency bundled to look convincing at a glance, a small tracking device buried beneath the false paperwork, and several files designed to suggest that Daniel had already compiled damning evidence against the association's leadership. He wanted to know exactly who would come for it, and how far up the chain that decision would travel. On the night he had been anticipating for weeks, his exterior cameras recorded the guards approaching the garage just after midnight. Victoria arrived only minutes later, stepping out of her own vehicle with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Melissa Grant's phone rang twice inside the frame of the camera, and Victoria answered both calls with clipped, urgent responses, glancing repeatedly toward the dark windows of Daniel's house, as though she could sense something was wrong but could not name what. A black SUV without any HOA markings idled near the community gate, its headlights off, waiting. Daniel let them in. He had disabled nothing, interfered with nothing, made no move to stop the break-in as it unfolded in real time, just feet from where he stood. The guards forced the garage's side door with practiced ease, the kind of ease that suggested this was far from their first unauthorized entry into a resident's home. They wrapped straps around the safe, hoisted it between them, and began the slow, straining walk toward the waiting vehicle outside. Inside the garage, one of the younger guards paused, glancing nervously toward the dark house behind them. "What if he catches us?" she whispered. Victoria's response carried no hesitation at all. "He won't." Daniel heard every word through the small audio recorder he had placed near the garage entrance days earlier, its signal quietly feeding directly to a secure recording device in his home office. As the safe was loaded into the back of the SUV and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, the tracking device buried inside the false documents activated exactly as designed, a faint signal pulsing steadily across the screen of Daniel's phone. He watched the dot begin to move, tracing a path away from the gated entrance and out toward the main road beyond the community walls. "Now we follow the box," Daniel said quietly to the empty room, already reaching for his car keys. He kept a careful distance behind the SUV as it wound through unfamiliar streets, headlights off for long stretches, relying instead on the glow of street lamps and the faint blue dot pulsing on his dashboard-mounted phone. The vehicle eventually left the manicured, tree-lined boulevards of the gated community entirely, merging onto a service road that ran alongside a stretch of industrial buildings on the edge of town. It slowed in front of a weathered warehouse, its metal siding rusted at the seams, a single security light buzzing above a loading dock door that rolled open just enough to let the vehicle pass through before sliding shut again. The service road was quiet at that hour, empty of traffic, the kind of silence that made every footstep feel louder than it was. Daniel kept the collar of his jacket turned up and moved with the unhurried pace of a man who belonged nowhere near the building he was watching, a habit ingrained from years of surveillance work where haste was the surest way to be noticed. Daniel parked several blocks away and approached on foot, staying low along a chain-link fence that bordered the property, careful to remain outside the narrow cone of the security light. Through a gap in the corrugated siding, he could see the interior of the warehouse illuminated by a scattering of work lamps, casting long shadows across stacked pallets and empty shelving units. 3 women stood near the safe as the guards set it down on the concrete floor, each one wearing the same navy windbreaker that marked them as part of Victoria's inner circle. Melissa Grant knelt beside the safe, working the combination with quick, confident fingers, while Victoria stood a few feet back, arms folded, watching with the tight, controlled patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. The door of the safe finally swung open, and for a moment nobody moved. Melissa began pulling out the false documents Daniel had planted, flipping through pages that meant nothing, envelopes of counterfeit cash that would not survive even the most casual inspection. Her expression shifted from anticipation to confusion, and then to something closer to panic. "Where's the real file?" she demanded, turning to face Victoria. "He must have moved it," Victoria said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. One of the other women stepped forward, snatching a folder from the safe and flipping through it with growing frustration, throwing pages aside when they proved useless. She turned toward Victoria with barely concealed anger, demanding to know how a plan they had spent so long preparing could have gone so wrong at the last possible moment. Crouched outside the warehouse wall, Daniel finally understood the full shape of what he had stumbled into weeks earlier without realizing it. This was never about money, not really, not primarily. The theft of cash and jewelry from various homes had simply been a byproduct, almost an afterthought, layered on top of something far more calculated. What Victoria and her circle were actually hunting for was an investigative file, one they believed contained evidence of exactly the kind of operation they were running. Evidence, Daniel now realized with growing clarity, of forged resident signatures used to authorize property changes without consent, of unauthorized entries into dozens of homes across the community, of quiet extortion dressed up as compliance fines, of at least 2 properties whose ownership had been manipulated through falsified HOA liens, and of a steady stream of funds routed through the fraudulent private security firm listed on the association's books. Somewhere along the way, someone inside Victoria's circle had grown careless enough to let word slip that a resident might be sitting on records dangerous enough to end all of it, and that single rumor had set this entire chain of events into motion. Inside the warehouse, one of the women straightened suddenly, her attention pulled towards something on a laptop resting on a folding table nearby. "There's one more problem," she said. Victoria's head snapped toward her. What? The detective. Victoria went very still, the color draining slightly from her face as the word hung in the cold warehouse air. The other women exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence that had carried them through months of quiet theft suddenly replaced by a creeping, unfamiliar fear none of them had prepared for. Victoria had spent nearly a decade building the kind of authority that most residents never thought to question, arriving in the neighborhood long before Daniel and slowly reshaping its governing board until every seat was filled with someone loyal to her. She had learned, over those years, precisely how far fear could stretch before it broke, how a well-timed fine could silence a complaint faster than any argument, how residents who valued their homes and their peace would rather comply than fight a system that always seemed to win. That confidence, cultivated so carefully, over so long, was precisely what made her slow to recognize the danger sitting quietly in the house on the corner lot. Word had reached Victoria through a contact inside the local police department, a fragmentary rumor that officers were quietly reviewing patterns across the recent string of neighborhood thefts, cross-referencing entry logs and inspection schedules in a way that suggested professional investigation rather than routine follow-up. Victoria became convinced someone inside the community was feeding information outward, possibly even planting listening devices in the HOA office itself. She ordered her officers to increase their scrutiny of residents who had recently moved in, running background checks disguised as standard welcome packet paperwork, watching for anyone whose behavior did not quite match the story they told their neighbors. Daniel's house became a frequent target of these tightened inspections, guards appearing at odd hours to check smoke detectors that had been checked only weeks before, to measure fence heights that had not changed, to note infractions that existed only on paper. Victoria personally signed off on several new fines against him within a single week, testing to see whether the quiet, compliant resident would finally crack under pressure. Daniel, understanding exactly what she was doing, allowed himself a carefully calculated flash of irritation during one confrontation at his front door, enough to seem human, not enough to seem suspicious. People who have nothing to hide don't act this nervous, Victoria said, watching him closely as she handed over yet another notice. Daniel took the paper without breaking eye contact. And people who have nothing to fear don't need guards breaking into houses. The words landed harder than Daniel had expected, and he watched something shift behind Victoria's eyes, a flicker of genuine uncertainty replacing her usual composure. That single exchange was enough to convince her that Daniel Reed was not simply an unusually calm homeowner. She returned to her office that evening and pulled together everyone she trusted most, laying out her suspicion in blunt, urgent terms. "Find out who Daniel Reed really is," she instructed, sliding a folder of his publicly available information across the table. It did not take her circle long. Public records, a poorly scrubbed old department newsletter, a photograph from a retired colleague's social gathering years earlier, small threads that, once pulled together, unraveled the identity Daniel had worked carefully to protect. One of Victoria's officers burst into her office 2 days later, breathless, holding a single printed page. "We found his real name," she said. Victoria took the paper from her hand and stared down at the words printed across it, her expression hardening into something colder and more dangerous than mere suspicion. The image cut away before she spoke another word, leaving only the weight of what she now knew hanging in the room behind her. Victoria now understood that Daniel Reed was, in fact, Detective Daniel Reed, though she still had no clear sense of how much evidence he had actually gathered, or how close he truly was to moving against her. She summoned him to the HOA office the following afternoon, dropping every pretense of neighborly courtesy the moment he stepped through the door. Gone was the polite, professional woman who signed off on landscaping approvals with a practiced smile. In her place sat someone sharper. "You should have left the neighborhood when you had the chance," Victoria said, not bothering to offer him a seat. "You should have stopped stealing from your residents," Daniel replied evenly, remaining standing near the doorway. Victoria allowed herself a short, humorless laugh. "You have no warrant." "I don't need one to know what you did," Daniel said. She leaned forward across her desk, listing out precisely what she intended to do to him, threats delivered with the calm efficiency of a woman accustomed to winning every confrontation she entered. She would contact his superiors and claim harassment. She would have him formally suspended pending an internal investigation into his conduct. She would file charges accusing him of unauthorized entry onto HOA-managed property, of impersonating a resident under false pretenses, of a dozen other manufactured offenses her legal team could assemble by morning. Daniel listened to every word without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of what he already knew, that the small recorder in his jacket pocket had captured every syllable of the conversation from the moment he walked through her door. Victoria believed, in that moment, that she held every advantage, that her threats had rattled a man finally cornered and out of options. Daniel simply rose from his chair when she finished, buttoned his jacket, and offered her a brief, almost courteous nod. "Thank you for confirming everything," he said. The color drained from Victoria's face as she watched him walk out, the sudden, sickening realization settling over her that she had just handed him precisely what he needed, wrapped in her own voice, delivered entirely on her own terms. In the days that followed, Victoria and her circle scrambled to regain control of a narrative they could feel slipping away from them. They pulled together a heavily edited clip of security footage, cutting and rearranging timestamps to make it appear that Daniel had broken into the HOA office himself, rifling through confidential resident files late at night. They circulated the footage quietly among trusted neighbors, planting seeds of doubt about the strange, quiet man who had moved in only months earlier and now seemed to be at the center of every unsettling rumor. Some residents, worn down by years of unquestioning deference to Victoria's authority, began to whisper that perhaps the association had been right about him all along, that the quiet stranger on the corner lot had never really belonged among them. Victoria called an emergency community meeting, packing the room with anxious homeowners eager for answers about the recent string of thefts. She stood at the front of the hall and delivered a carefully rehearsed speech, describing Daniel as a dangerous outsider who had infiltrated their peaceful neighborhood under false pretenses, who had trespassed onto private HOA property, who had stolen sensitive documents belonging to the association itself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain glances passing between neighbors who had once considered Daniel a quiet, unremarkable presence on their street. Victoria watched the room turn, felt the tide shifting exactly as she had planned it, and allowed herself, for the first time in days, the smallest measure of relief. Daniel said nothing throughout her entire speech, sitting quietly near the back of the room, his face unreadable. Victoria assumed his silence meant defeat, that he understood the fight was already lost and had come only to accept his public humiliation without further resistance. She could not have been more wrong. As she opened the floor for a final vote on formally banning him from further community involvement, the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Daniel walked forward, accompanied by 2 investigators in plain clothes, their badges visible at their belts. He stepped up to the podium Victoria had just vacated and began setting items methodically onto the table in front of him. Camera footage showing the guards carrying the safe from his garage, audio recordings of Victoria's own instructions that night, and every threat she had made in her office days earlier, GPS logs tracing the tracking device from his property directly to the warehouse, financial records showing irregular transfers between the HOA account and the fraudulent security firm, a stack of case files documenting the pattern connecting every theft in the neighborhood back to HOA inspection visits. "Before anyone votes to remove me from this community," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "you should know who you're trying to evict." He placed his detective's badge on the table beside the stack of evidence, the metal catching the overhead light as gasps rippled through the crowded room. "Detective Daniel Reed," he said, "Major Crimes Division." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling fans overhead. Victoria stood frozen near the podium, her carefully constructed composure cracking visibly for the first time since Daniel had moved into the neighborhood. She opened her mouth as though to object, then closed it again, seeming to understand instinctively that whatever she said next would only make things worse. Daniel continued laying out his evidence piece by piece, methodical and unhurried, exactly the way he had built every case throughout his career. He described the camera footage first, the 2 guards struggling under the weight of the safe, while Victoria stood behind them signing off on the theft as though it were routine paperwork. He played the audio recording next, Victoria's own voice filling the silent hall, as she instructed her officers to move carefully because they did not have much time. He displayed the GPS tracking data on a small projector screen, a red line tracing directly from his garage to the rusted warehouse on the edge of town. He pulled up the HOA's financial records, highlighting transfers to the private security firm that existed on paper only, a shell company with no actual employees, no actual services rendered, nothing but a conduit for moving stolen money. He laid out the pattern connecting every reported theft in the neighborhood to a prior HOA inspection request, a pattern that no coincidence could explain away. Finally, he introduced a resident willing to testify, a woman who had lost several $1,000s from a home safe only weeks after HOA guards had requested access to check her smoke detectors. Daniel then turned to a final piece of evidence, a spreadsheet projected across the screen behind him, cataloging every fine issued over the previous 3 years, alongside the corresponding inspection requests and reported losses that followed within weeks of each one. The pattern was undeniable once laid out in a single unbroken timeline, address after address, violation after violation, each one shadowed by a theft that the association had dismissed as unrelated. He pointed out that certain properties had been targeted repeatedly, fined for the same manufactured infractions month after month, worn down until the residents simply stopped questioning the visits altogether. He noted that Victoria's own signature appeared on every single authorization form, a detail Melissa Grant's careful bookkeeping had preserved even when other records had been altered or destroyed. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd as residents began to understand exactly how long they had been living under a system designed to extract from them rather than protect them. One woman near the front row rose slowly from her seat, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You fined me for refusing to give you my house key," she said, staring directly at Victoria. "Because they needed access," Daniel said quietly, not looking away from Victoria as he spoke. Another neighbor stood, then another, each one recalling some small, humiliating encounter with the association that had felt, at the time, like an isolated inconvenience rather than part of a larger design. An older man near the back recounted the afternoon guards had insisted on inspecting his crawl space for a supposed pest violation, only for a watch belonging to his late father to go missing days later. A young mother described being fined repeatedly until she finally relented and handed over a spare key, just to make the visit stop. Victoria listened to each account, her jaw tightening with every word, watching decades of carefully constructed authority collapse in real time under the weight of testimony she could no longer suppress. Victoria's hands gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles whitening as she searched desperately for some remaining thread of control over the room. "None of this proves I stole anything," she said, her voice sharper now, more defensive. Daniel studied her for a long moment before responding. "You're right," he said. The room held its breath, uncertain where his admission was leading. Victoria's expression flickered with something almost like hope, a brief, desperate belief that perhaps she had found an opening after all. "That's why I brought the people who can," Daniel finished. The doors at the back of the hall swung open once more, and this time a full investigative team stepped through, moving with quiet efficiency toward the front of the room where Victoria stood exposed, under the weight of every eye in the community. One of the investigators approached her directly, informing her of her rights in a calm, practiced voice that carried easily through the silent hall. Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely, her hands trembling as an officer secured them behind her back. Before she was led out of the building she had once ruled with absolute authority, she turned back one final time to look at Daniel, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and something close to grudging respect. "You think this ends with me?" she said. "No," Daniel answered simply. "I think you're the beginning." In the weeks that followed, the investigation Daniel had spent months building expanded, far beyond what even he had initially anticipated. Officers questioned every HOA guard who had participated in the unauthorized property entries, and one by one, the loyalty Victoria had spent years cultivating began to crumble under the weight of formal charges and the promise of reduced sentences for cooperation. The warehouse on the edge of town was searched thoroughly, revealing not only the false safe Daniel had planted but dozens of boxes containing documents, jewelry, and cash stolen from residents across multiple neighborhoods the association had quietly expanded its reach into over the years. Investigators traced financial records back through years of falsified fines and manufactured violations, uncovering a scheme far larger than anyone in the community had imagined, one that reached into at least 2 neighboring associations, where former colleagues of Victoria had quietly replicated the same tactics under different names. Detectives from those jurisdictions soon reached out to Daniel directly, comparing notes on patterns they had only recently begun to notice themselves, grateful for a case file thorough enough to accelerate investigations that might otherwise have taken years to unravel on their own. Melissa Grant, faced with overwhelming evidence pulled directly from her own meticulous bookkeeping, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency, providing detailed records of every fraudulent transaction the association had processed, including 2 properties where forged signatures had been used to quietly transfer partial ownership into shell entities controlled by Victoria herself. Stolen cash and jewelry recovered from the warehouse were slowly returned to their rightful owners. Families who had spent months believing their missing belongings were simply gone forever, victims of unfortunate but unrelated burglaries, rather than a coordinated scheme run by the very organization meant to protect their community. Detectives working alongside Daniel spent long hours cataloging every item recovered from the warehouse shelves, matching serial numbers and photographs against months of resident complaint files, slowly reconstructing a timeline of loss that stretched back years further than anyone had initially realized. Some families had moved away from the community entirely before the truth came to light, convinced their missing belongings were simply the price of living somewhere so tightly controlled, and investigators worked to track many of them down so the recovered property could finally find its way home. Harold Pierce, the widower who had lost his late wife's jewelry, wept quietly when an officer placed the small velvet box back into his hands, turning each piece over as though reassuring himself it was real. The young couple, whose legal documents had disappeared, learned that the missing papers had been used to manipulate a property dispute entirely in the association's favor, a fraud now unwound piece by piece as investigators rebuilt the true record of what had happened. Every recovered item told the same story, of a community that had trusted the people meant to protect it, only to discover that trust had been quietly weaponized against them for years. The Homeowners Association itself was placed under emergency oversight. Its leadership dissolved entirely as residents voted to restructure the entire governing board from the ground up. Neighbors who had spent years too intimidated to question Victoria's authority finally found their voices, sharing stories of quiet harassment and unfair treatment that stretched back far longer than anyone had previously admitted. New bylaws were drafted with input from residents rather than dictated from above, term limits were introduced for board positions, and independent financial audits became a permanent requirement rather than a suggestion easily ignored. A resident committee was formed to review any future request for property access, ensuring no single officer or board member could again authorize an unsupervised entry into a family's home without independent sign-off. Meetings that had once been dominated by a single commanding voice slowly became genuine discussions, neighbors speaking freely for the first time in years without fear of a fine appearing in their mailbox the following morning. The community that had once prided itself on order and control began instead to rebuild itself around something closer to trust, imperfect and still healing, but no longer built on silence. The woman who had once stood in front of the community and declared with absolute confidence that this was her neighborhood now found herself walking out of that same HOA office in handcuffs, escorted past the very residents she had spent years controlling through fear and manufactured authority. A colleague later asked Daniel a question that had clearly been on the minds of everyone involved in the case since the truth had come to light. "Why did you let them take the safe?" the detective asked, genuinely curious about the reasoning behind such an unusual approach. Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile before answering. "Because sometimes you don't catch criminals by stopping them," he said. "You catch them by giving them exactly what they think they want." That evening, Daniel returned to the house that had served as both his home and his undercover post for so many months. The case finally closed, the community finally free of the organization that had exploited it for years. The garage stood empty where the false safe had once sat. The elaborate trap he had constructed now, nothing more than evidence locked away in a police storage facility. On the small table near the garage entrance, however, sat something new. The genuine safe he had kept hidden throughout the entire investigation, containing every real piece of evidence he had gathered from the very first night he moved into the neighborhood. Daniel opened it briefly, running his hand over the stack of files inside, the true record of everything he had uncovered during his months undercover. He thought of the families who would sleep easier now, of Harold Pierce and his late wife's jewelry, of the young couple who had finally reclaimed their disputed property, of every quiet act of intimidation that would no longer be tolerated behind the gates of that neighborhood. There would be other cases waiting for him, other communities where authority had quietly curdled into something else, but for tonight the file in front of him was finally, completely closed. He closed the safe carefully, turned the lock, and set it back into place. Outside, the street was quiet, in a way it had never quite managed to be during Victoria's years in charge, porch lights glowing steadily along the curb, a neighbor walking a dog at an easy, unhurried pace without glancing nervously toward the HOA office window. It was a small, ordinary scene, the kind most people never noticed, and it was exactly the kind of peace Daniel had spent so many months quietly working to restore. Then he walked to the small camera mounted above his front door, the same one that had captured the theft that started everything, and looked directly into the lens one final time. "Wrong house," he said quietly. In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to something resembling ordinary life. Block parties resuming, garden clubs reforming, neighbors greeting one another across driveways without the quiet calculation of who might be reporting to whom. The fear that had once hummed beneath every polite exchange faded a little more each week, replaced by the simple, unremarkable rhythm of people living beside one another without dread. They had believed they were breaking into the home of an ordinary man, someone quiet and unremarkable, easily intimidated into silence. They never understood that they had walked into the one house in the entire neighborhood where every single move they made was already part of a police investigation, where their own greed and arrogance had handed a patient detective every piece of evidence he needed to bring their entire operation down. Victoria Hale and the guards who had carried out her orders now faced the full weight of the justice system they had spent years evading, while the residents they had exploited slowly rebuilt a community no longer ruled by fear disguised as order. Detective Daniel Reed closed the file on Case 47B and quietly moved on to the next investigation waiting for him, carrying with him the same patient, unshakable resolve that had brought Victoria Hale's carefully hidden empire crashing down around her.